Now that we're getting used to applying a more sophisticated pattern of arrangement to our Q1 and Q3 essays, let's explore how we might redesign the Q2. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and pause the video at this time to complete the reflection that you're given there. Reflect on the question in a paragraph. Make sure you write informally and off the top of your head. When you're finished with the reflection, go ahead and unpause the video to continue the lesson. Let's take some notes. The Q2 rhetorical analysis essay task is a straightforward writing task. You can approach it the same way no matter what passage you get to analyze. Unlike the Q1 and Q3, which require different approaches depending on what kind of prompt you get. The traditional pattern of arranging a Q2 goes something like this. Paragraph 1 is your introduction, where you introduce the text, explain the rhetorical situation, the writer, audience, context, and all that, and establish your thesis. Paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 act as your body paragraphs, with each paragraph identifying a different rhetorical choice that the writer makes, explaining the intended effects on the audience of this rhetorical choice and connecting that rhetorical choice back to the rhetorical situation. Paragraph 5 is your conclusion paragraph, which recaps the rhetorical choices that the writer makes and closes by remarking on the general effectiveness of the rhetoric. Once again, though, just like we saw in the Q1 and Q3, this pattern causes timing issues, especially with those body paragraphs. Each body paragraph has to identify a choice, give text evidence, explain the effects, and connect it to a situation under this traditional model. And doing all of those things 3 times over for 3 separate body paragraphs is difficult to do in just 40 minutes. But if we apply a new pattern of arrangement similar to what we did with the Q1 and Q3, we can potentially save time writing and better focus our analysis. But before we continue, we first need to understand what a text analysis task actually is. There are 2 different ways to approach analyzing a text. The first is what we would call a traditional analysis, where we examine a single feature or closely related features of a text in depth to determine how that feature or those features create meaning within the text. That's a more macroscopic approach to analyzing a text, and we just call this a typical analysis. The other way we can analyze a text is through a method called explication. Explication involves examining every single significant feature of a text, usually line by line or sentence by sentence, to determine everything that contributes meaning to that text. This is a far more microscopic approach to text analysis. Explication, as you can imagine, takes a lot longer to do than a mere focused analysis. And really, explication tasks are best for analyzing poetry or short excerpts from fiction or drama. And honestly, the Q2 passage is short enough that you could definitely do a full explication of it. But it would take way more time than we have on the AP Lang exam, and it honestly isn't what the exam makers are expecting you to do. So instead, a focused, in-depth analysis of just one feature or a couple of related features, that's going to be much better suited to what the Q2 wants you to do. So with that in mind, here is our new pattern of arrangement for the Q2. It's going to look exactly like the patterns we've been dealing with. Paragraph 1, that's your engage the audience stage. Prime the audience in paragraph 2. Guide them through your analysis in paragraphs 3 and 4. Lead them to your conclusion at the beginning of paragraph 5. And then finally end paragraph 5, making the audience care. Let's go through each one of those paragraphs one by one to see how it specifically applies to the rhetorical analysis task. So paragraph one is going to be our standard introduction. It's not going to change a whole lot. The goal here we have to keep in mind is to engage the audience. So our hook here, we're going to hook with the exigence of the text, talk a little bit about what was going on at the time the writer created the text that inspired them to create it. Then we're going to get into the rest of the rhetorical situation, explain the writer, audience, subject, and context. We're still going to establish a thesis at the end of our introduction, although here in a moment I'll show you how that thesis is going to change just a little bit. And the introduction should still be 100 to 150 words. You never want to go over that on a 40-minute timed essay because you're really just wasting time not getting into the stuff that really matters for your score. Paragraph 2, here we're going to prime the audience, and what that's going to look like in our rhetorical analysis is we're going to spend this paragraph focusing on one major rhetorical obstacle that's inhibiting the writer from achieving that primary purpose. Okay, so we're going to use this paragraph to identify what that obstacle is, explain in detail where that obstacle comes from within the rhetorical situation, and finally explain how overcoming this obstacle is necessary to achieving the writer's purpose. By establishing one specific major rhetorical obstacle up front, it's going to help focus our analysis on just those rhetorical choices that work to overcome this obstacle. In all, this should be relatively short for a body paragraph, 100 to 150 words, though honestly you could probably get away with 75 to 100 words on something like this because, again, you're just explaining one specific rhetorical obstacle. Paragraphs 3 through 4, here's where we're trying to guide the audience through our analysis, and we're going to base everything off of that rhetorical obstacle we identified in paragraph 2. So each paragraph 3 and paragraph 4, will analyze a single rhetorical choice and the various specific techniques and devices used as part of that choice. What we're also going to do with this new pattern of arrangement is make sure that our actual analysis paragraphs mention that the order of these techniques and devices matters. And so you're going to see that here in a moment when we look at some samples. We want to acknowledge that the writer first does this thing to overcome the obstacle, and then by doing that thing, they can then do this other thing that will help them further overcome the obstacle. Also, when you write using this new pattern of development, arrangement rather, you're going to notice that these paragraphs, these actual analysis paragraphs where you analyze a rhetorical choice, they're actually going to be shorter than what you've done in the past. And that's because you no longer have to spend time in these paragraphs identifying and explaining a rhetorical obstacle, which if you remember from how we have written rhetorical analysis paragraphs in the past, that can take up 40 to 50% of your paragraph. So right there, there's no more need for that because we've already covered the rhetorical obstacle in a different paragraph. Finally, paragraph 5, this is our conclusion. Two goals here. The first is to lead the audience to your conclusion. The second is to make the audience care about that conclusion. So we're going to start the paragraph with a couple of sentences recapping the rhetorical choices that we analyzed in paragraphs 3 and 4. We're going to recap the obstacle as well that we identified in paragraph 2 and just explain how it all helps achieve the writer's primary purpose. We're going to finish up paragraph 5 with just a couple of sentences expounding on the general effectiveness of the rhetoric, just like we've practiced in the past. So there are some key changes that I'm sure you've noticed with this new pattern. So here really quickly are the key changes with this new pattern of arrangement. First of all, your intro and thesis is going to be slightly different. Your analysis paragraphs, there's only going to be 2 of them this time, and they're going to be focused rather than on particular rhetorical techniques. They're actually going to be focused on goals, specific rhetorical goals. We'll talk about that in a minute. And lastly, you're no longer trying to cover the whole passage, which is really something we didn't emphasize to begin with, but now we're definitely not trying to cover the whole passage. All right, so the intro and thesis are going to be slightly different here. You're still going to hook the audience by identifying and explaining the exigence. You're still going to transition from the exigence with a sentence that introduces the text as a response to the exigence. You're still explaining the rest of the rhetorical situation, the writer, the audience, the subject matter, the context. However, before you get to the thesis, you will then need to identify the primary purpose. This can be in a sentence by itself, or it can be included in a previous sentence. It really doesn't matter, but the purpose is no longer part of the thesis. Instead, your thesis is going to identify that primary obstacle that's inhibiting the writer from achieving their purpose, and then the two rhetorical goals, which we'll again go over what that means in a moment, two rhetorical goals that are pursued in order to overcome that obstacle. So what do I mean by focusing the analysis paragraphs on goals? Because when we first learned how to write rhetorical analysis, I taught you guys to always lead off a rhetorical analysis paragraph by identifying a specific rhetorical technique, not a stylistic device, but a specific technique. Now we're doing this slightly differently and trying to conceptualize what the writer's doing based on goals they're trying to achieve. So here's what I mean by that. The topic sentence for an analysis paragraph should not mention specific rhetorical techniques or devices. It should not mention appeals to pity or shame or confidence. It should not mention the writer's persona or different kinds of arguments. It still should definitely never mention stylistic devices like metaphor or different kinds of diction. Don't do that. Instead, your topic sentence should identify a general goal that the writer is trying to achieve in order to overcome the obstacle. This goal should still be focused on just one of the three means of persuasion. So the goal you identify could be to help the audience understand something. That's the realm of logos. To help them view the writer in a certain way. That's ethos. Or to help the audience feel a particular way about something. That's pathos. Lastly, I need to reiterate this, we're not trying to cover the whole passage, especially not with this new pattern of arrangement that is more focused. Remember, this is not an explication. We're not trying to go line by line or even paragraph by paragraph through the passage that we're given. Nowhere in the prompt does it say we have to do this. We don't have to analyze the whole passage. We can just analyze a significant portion of the passage, and that's enough. Okay, at this time, let's go ahead and pause the video. I want you to go back and reread the Florence Kelley speech against child labor that we read at the very beginning of this year when we were doing our first extended rhetorical analyses. This, of course, is the text that I analyze in all of my sample work. So go ahead and pause the video and read this text again, refamiliarize yourself with it. When you're finished reading, go ahead and unpause the video so we can continue with the lesson. So the Q2 prompt is always going to be phrased the exact same way. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices blank makes in order to convey his or her message to his or her audience, right? So here we're going to analyze the rhetorical choices that Florence Kelley makes to convey her message to her audience. The prompt also specifies that our responses should respond to the prompt with a thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. Select and use evidence to support your line of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. Demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. That's a big one that a lot of students across the country overlook. And finally, use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. That fourth one there, demonstrating and understanding the rhetorical situation, if we use this new pattern of arrangement, we can't help but do that because we're devoting an entire paragraph, paragraph 2, to pulling out elements of the rhetorical situation and explaining this significant rhetorical constraint, this obstacle that the writer faces. And we're making sure that our analysis paragraphs 3 and 4 are both based on how they're responding to that rhetorical constraint. So the pattern will help us definitely do that. The reason why I like to use this passage so much for my samples is that it's got so much that we could write about. So many different rhetorical choices that she makes in this passage. We clearly don't have time to write about all of them, and we're not intended to do so. So what I want to show you now is 3 different essay outlines that I could use to write an essay in response to this analysis prompt. So here's the first one. My thesis might go something like this. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome the socioeconomic disconnect between her audience and her subject matter by first enlightening them to the severity of the problem and then investing the audience personally in solving it. So my thesis kind of has 3 parts there. I've identified a specific rhetorical obstacle, or generally identified. Remember, I don't need to explain my obstacle yet. This is just my thesis. And then I've briefly identified 2 different rhetorical choices that help overcome that obstacle. So my essay outline, I'd start with my introduction paragraph, just as I talked about earlier. And then in paragraph 2, where I'm priming the audience, I'm going to focus on explaining this rhetorical obstacle. I'm going to explain the socioeconomic disconnect between the audience, who's made up of middle class and wealthy women predominantly, and explain the disconnect between that and Florence Kelly's subject matter, which is poor working children. With that obstacle explained in paragraph 2, paragraph 3 is going to analyze the ways in which Kelly first attempts to enlighten the audience on just how terrible and widespread the issue of child labor is. Because if it's something they feel a disconnect with, they first need to be educated on what it is. I'll follow that up in paragraph 4 by analyzing the ways in which Kelly uses her audience's newfound knowledge and understanding of the issue to make them care personally about it. And I'll talk about some of the emotional appeals that she uses to kind of build off of that logos knowledge and turn that into kind of a pathos caring about the situation. And then, of course, finally, I'll wrap it up with my standard conclusion paragraph. Here is another way that I could approach this analysis, looking at some different rhetorical choices and a different obstacle. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome the apparent difference between her cause and the cause that the audience has attended the conference to support by first making the issue of child labor sympathetic to the audience and then linking the struggle against child labor with the audience's struggle for suffrage. Okay, so different obstacle here and a couple of different rhetorical choices, rhetorical goals, as I like to call them now, that the writer's pursuing to overcome that obstacle. So I'm going to start with my standard introduction. And then my second paragraph, the first body paragraph, I'm going to explain the obstacle. Here I want to explain the seemingly different goals of the speaker and the audience. We have a child labor advocate, or an anti-child labor advocate would probably be more precise there, addressing a suffrage organization. And those 2 goals would seem to be not necessarily at odds with each other, but definitely not the same thing, right? Once I've established that obstacle, I'm going to analyze in my first analysis paragraph, paragraph 3, the ways in which Kelly first attempts to make the issue of child labor sympathetic to the audience. So generally just making them sympathetic to the plight of the children workers. Then in paragraph 4, I'll talk about how she uses this sympathy to then demonstrate that her struggle against child labor can only be won by the audience first winning their struggle of getting the vote, thus giving them added fuel to their own fight. And then lastly, I'll finish it up with my standard conclusion. Let's look at one final approach to this analysis. My thesis would read this. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome her audience's acquiescence to child labor practices by first making the issue a moral imperative to the audience and then providing them with an accessible way to act on that imperative. Let's start off with my standard introduction. Paragraph 2, I would explain that the audience's acquiescence toward child labor practices comes from their perceived blamelessness in the issue and powerlessness to help. After all, she is talking to a group of people who at the time didn't have the power to vote, so they were kind of politically weakened by that. And so naturally they just sort of acquiesced to the whole issue. Yeah, darn, it's a terrible thing, child labor, but I'm not involved, and what can I, it doesn't affect me. I'm not the one to blame here, and I couldn't do anything to help if I wanted to. So that's kind of the obstacle that I've identified here. In my third paragraph, I'd analyze the ways in which Kelly makes the issue of child labor a moral imperative for the audience. So not just something they should care about, but something that they are morally obligated to help end. And then with my fourth paragraph, I'm going to analyze the ways in which Kelly then gives the audience a way to act on this moral imperative through a call to action that actually acknowledges the audience's diminished political power. If you remember from the speech, she gives a very specific call to action, knowing that her audience can't vote against this issue. She says that the audience can go out and instill the working men, so the male-dominated labor movement at this time, because men could vote. And then lastly, finish up with my standard conclusion. All right, go ahead and pause the video at this time to complete the first and only exercise in this lesson. Here you're going to study a redesigned Model Q2 essay so you can see the new pattern of arrangement put to use. When you're finished with the exercise, go ahead and unpause the video to continue the lesson. All right, let's go over each of the 5 paragraphs here and the parts that I asked you to identify. So here's my introduction here. Note it's only 127 words, so coming in comfortably under that 150 word limit that I like to stick to. My very first sentence identifies the exigence. The next sentence identifies the text as a response to the exigence, and I identify who the author is. The basic subject matter of the speech is kind of implied in child labor advocacy, who the audience is, and finally the context, the when and the where. My next sentence identifies the purpose in a sentence by itself, and then I have my thesis. And you can see that this is the thesis from that first essay outline that I showed you. The next paragraph, paragraph 2, that identifies and explains the rhetorical obstacle. It starts off with a simple kind of topic sentence that generally identifies the obstacle, what's going on here, what's inhibiting the speaker from achieving their purpose. And then the explanation of that since only people from middle and upper class households would have the means to attend this kind of conference, it's reasonable to assume that her audience has probably never experienced sending a child into the workforce, that sort of thing. My third paragraph, notice the word count there, gone down dramatically from upwards of 300 words down to 235, and this is the longest paragraph in the whole essay. It starts off with a topic sentence that, again, doesn't identify any specific rhetorical techniques or any specific devices. Instead, it identifies a general goal that the writer is trying to achieve to overcome that obstacle. The first way she goes about closing that socioeconomic gap in understanding is by attempting to enlighten the audience. Okay. Then I've got text evidence supporting that, where I talk about some of the statistics she throws out there, explanation of the intended effect of those statistics, talk about more text evidence, this time identifying a stylistic element in asyndeton, and more explanation of the intended effect of that asyndeton. And then I wrap the whole paragraph up just with a statement that kind of brings us back to why she's doing this. How is this helping overcome that obstacle? Paragraph 4 is even shorter than paragraph 3, and I've got the exact same thing here. First sentence is my topic sentence. Then I get into some text evidence that talks about anargeia. I specify what's in that anargeia technique there, the use of visual and auditory imagery in my explanations. Then I talk a little bit more include a little more text evidence, how the appeal to pity is strengthened through a particular stylistic device, in this case metaphor. And then I wrap up the whole paragraph paragraph with another one-sentence explanation, just explaining how all of this particular goal is helping overcome the obstacle. And then finally, my conclusion here. Conclusion comes in a little bit longer than the intro, just like it should. And I start off by recapping the rhetorical goals that the writer tries to achieve with a very long sentence there, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned again the specific rhetorical devices and techniques. The reason why I mention the specific rhetorical devices and techniques again in my conclusion is that the AP readers really like to see that. There's nothing on the scoring guidelines that say you actually have to mention techniques and devices by name, but as a longtime AP reader, I know that a lot of them won't give you credit unless they see those names. Now, they're not supposed to do that, but who's going to stop them, right? And so it's better just to meet their expectations. So identify it again in your conclusion. I follow that up by recapping what that obstacle was, and then my final few sentences just talk about just some commentary on the general effectiveness of her rhetoric. All right, now that you know what this new pattern of arrangement is going to look like for the Q2, go ahead and move on to completing the follow-up writing workshop assignment, which will have you look back at the Q2 essay that you wrote on the mock exam and redesign it using the new pattern of arrangement.